Hi, in this video, this will be the first of two videos for this chapter on animal diversity. In this first video, we'll talk about how animals and the origin of animals fits in with the history of life on Earth that we've already talked about with plants and in previous units. And we'll talk a little bit about the characteristics of animals and the emergence of animals onto land. So animals as a kingdom are all multicellular and heterotrophic. Multicellular means there's no single-celled animals, and heterotrophic means that there aren't any truly photosynthetic animals. There are a few that take in photosynthetic algae into their bodies and benefit from the photosynthesis of those algae. But we'll talk more about those in the invertebrates chapter. And as you'll see, just like so many things in biology, when you make a general rule about something, there's an exception over here. And that is also true as we try to categorize animals based on various components of their body plans. In order to make monophyletic clades, sometimes we have animals in the same clade that have different morphological traits for some character because it's biology. Animals have the highest level of specialized cells of any group and also lack cell walls. So instead of cell walls, animals have extracellular matrix, which is the ECM. And collagen is one of the important proteins that makes up the extracellular matrix. So why isn't it a cell wall? And that's because it's completely permeable. Think of the extracellular matrix as like a fishing net that surrounds the cells and sort of helps them hold their shape and helps them stick to each other and helps them stick to substrates and receive signals, but it doesn't provide a barrier to molecules the way that a cell wall does. Animals uniquely have nervous tissue, muscles, and large movements. That's one of the other characteristics of the animal kingdom is animals are motile, at least at some stage of their development. And as you'll see, there are some animals that are only motile in their embryonic stages. Animals mostly have sexual reproduction, and they use eggs and sperm as their gametes. If you might remember that there are organisms like fungi that have gametes that are all the same size, so they're not eggs and sperm. Animals have eggs and sperm. There are a few groups of animals, as we'll see, that have lost sexual reproduction, but that's kind of rare within the animal kingdom. Most animals have fertilization and of an egg by a sperm, and they also have some kind of early development, and they all have very similar, very early developmental stages that we'll talk about, including a blastula and a gastrula stage, and forming layers of embryonic tissues. And we can see the beginnings of this even in the most primitive animals, the sponges. So all animals have this basic kind of early development, starting with a fertilized egg, which remember we call a zygote. It's not an embryo until it starts to divide. When it's still one cell, it's a zygote. Cells begin to divide, and finally they form a hollow ball, and that's the blastula stage. And all animals, including sponges, have a blastula stage. Then there is a stage where the outer layer inverts into the inner layer, and this forms at least two tissue layers, and then as you'll see, many animals form a third tissue layer, which we call germ layers. And again, we're using germ in the sense of germinate or grow, not germ as in pathogen. So the blastula and the gastrulation stages, we'll talk a bit more about that and the differences between different animals and how they do this. But this basic process of initial cleavage of the fertilized egg, forming a hollowed out ball, and then inverting part of the outer wall, this occurs in all animals. And here's a little video of a sea urchin developing. Scientists who study early development really like the sea urchin as a model organism because you can get them to lay massive amounts of eggs in the lab and release their sperm. They have fertilization just in the water column, and their embryos are transparent at the early stages, which makes them really good for studying live under the microscope. So this video is, of course, very sped up time lapse. The little dots that you see moving around, those are the sperm, so you can see the size difference between the sperm and the egg. There's our first cell division. Now this is mitosis. Now it's an embryo, that it has at least 2 cells. And then we continue dividing. Now we jump to the blastula stage, the hollow ball stage. All animals have this stage. And then one part of the blastula is going to start to ingress into the cavity, and you can see some little cells kind of wandering around in there. Those are the third germ layer, the mesoderm, in these particular organisms. And now we can see the gut starting to form. That first in-pouching of that outer blastula we call the archenteron, or the first gut is what that means. So we can see all 3 germ layers here. We can see the hold on, let me go back to my pointer here. We can see the outer layer, or the ectoderm. We can see the primitive gut forming, the archenteron, that's the endoderm. And then we can see these other cells in between. Those are the mesoderm, boringly named because they're in the middle. Meso means middle, in the middle of the other layers. Most animals have a larval stage as well. We don't, but most animals do. And a larval stage, the difference between a larval stage and just a juvenile is the larval stage looks different. It's morphologically distinct, and it's never sexually mature. It's always immature. And eventually these animals will go through some kind of a metamorphosis, and then they will look like a miniature adult, and that's a juvenile. So this is the caterpillar of a moth, and so this is a larval stage. It doesn't look like a moth at all at this point. And this is a tadpole. This is the larva of a frog. And amphibians are the only vertebrates that have a larval stage like this. The rest of the vertebrates, the reptiles, mammals, birds don't have a larval stage. The origin of animals. The first clue as to which protist group gave rise to the animals was just structural. There's a group of protists called the choanoflagellates that have cells that look like cells in sponges. And it's been thought for a long time that sponges were the most primitive animals. And if you didn't know that sponges were alive, well, they are, and they're animals. And you might think, well, they don't move. Well, they have an embryonic stage or a larval stage that does move, that swims. But the choanoflagellates, these cells here, so this is one cell, they have this little basket of microvilli and then a single flagella. And the flagella has 2 functions. If it's a single cell like this, the flagella might be used for swimming around. But if it's in a colony like this, the flagella will be used to direct water into the basket, this little microvillar basket, and that will collect food that they then take into the cell. So it also functions for eating, so movement and eating. And some choanoflagellates are colonial, meaning that they clump together into small groups like this, or even large balls, hollow balls of cells with all of their flagella facing outwards. So that was thought to be the closest relative to animals because sea sponges use the same kind of cells to feed. Sea sponges, if you look at the inside of the sponge, so sponges are hollow on the inside, and they feed, they're filter feeders, using cells on the inside. and the cells look exactly like this. They look exactly like choanoflagellates. And DNA has confirmed that in fact choanoflagellates are the protist that's closest to animals. So the first animal was a choanoflagellate that instead of just being a colonial organism, formed a truly multicellular organism, which was a sponge. So here we have all of the eukaryotes down here, and choanoflagellates, which choanoflagellates, some are individual and some are colonial, and sometimes they can switch back and forth. They don't have differentiation, so that's why they're not truly multicellular, they're just colonial. And sponges are hollow on the inside. They draw water in and filter feed from the water column. Their feeding cells, or choanocytes, look exactly like these protists. And in fact, they feed the same way. They beat the flagella, and it draws water in and traps food particles in the little basket of microvilli, and then they take those in to the cell by endocytosis. So sponges are considered they are the first animals, and they are also the basal lineage within the animal kingdom. So let's refresh our memories about the history of life on Earth, since we're going to be talking about different periods and mass extinctions. So this is the entire history of Earth on a sort of like a clock face, a 24-hour clock. We had our early period here with nothing but prokaryotes. Cyanobacteria evolve here, and that's when the first free oxygen gas appears in the ocean and in the atmosphere. The first eukaryotes appear, the first multicellular eukaryotes, which the oldest fossils of multicellular eukaryotes are algae, not animals. Animals appear much later here, at the end of the Proterozoic, but before the colonization of the land by plants. So the first animals appear before the first plants appear. And then we'll talk about these periods too. So the Mesozoic, this is the age of the dinosaurs. The Cenozoic is sometimes called the age of mammals. That's the age we're in right now, is the Cenozoic. So the Neoproterozoic is the end of the Proterozoic. So let me go back for a second here. So here's the Proterozoic, very long eon here. The Proterozoic includes the first eukaryotes appearing, the first multicellular organisms appearing. So the Neoproterozoic is at the end here of the Proterozoic. So the Proterozoic includes the first animal fossils. And that period of the Neoproterozoic is called the Ediacara period. And that's where we find the oldest animal fossils, and also the oldest fossils that look like embryos, although there's some argument about that, about if they're really embryos. They do really look like embryos, though, the fossils from that period. And this is an artist's rendering of what the sea might have looked like during the Ediacaran period. We can see organisms here that are animals that look sort of algae-like. Here's an animal down here. There's some kind of jellyfish-looking animals there. So it was very, very different from what the sea is like today. So there are very few fossils of animals from this period because hard shells had not evolved yet. And if you remember about the fossil record is biased towards things that have hard shells or bones. So hard things, hard shells, hard bones are more likely to be preserved in the fossil record. It takes more special conditions for soft bodies. It takes very fine mud, volcanic ash, things like that to preserve soft bodies. So there's only a couple of places in the world where we find these fossils from this long ago, from the Pre-Cambrian And these are a couple of them. So this is an animal here that it looks kind of segmented and probably moved along the sea floor eating. This is another fossil of an animal from the Ediacaran period. There's evidence of predation. This little shell here is from another animal, and here's one of the first examples of a hard shell, which is why we even have this fossil. We don't have the fossil of whatever was living in this shell, but there's many examples of this, so we know that this is being secreted by some kind of a worm-like animal. And there's a hole in it, which looks just like the kind of holes that we still see in shells today from predation. So obviously, some animals were already eating other animals at this stage. The Paleozoic is the next era, and the Paleozoic, the beginning of the Paleozoic is the Cambrian period, and you might have heard of the Cambrian explosion. It used to be thought that this was when animals appeared, because suddenly there's massive amounts of fossils of animals in the fossil record, and it was only more recently that those Ediacaran older fossils were discovered. So for a long time, the earliest animal fossils known were from the Cambrian period. So, but it is a period of extreme diversification. It's the first appearance of bilaterally symmetric, with a complete digestive tract, animals that really start to diversify at that time. And there's some speculation about why then, why during this period, what was happening on Earth at the time in the environment perhaps that allowed the Cambrian explosion to happen. And one thing that was probably happening was that the Earth was warming at this time. So if it's warming, that allows more photosynthesis to occur, which will increase the oxygen, which allows these kind of active, mobile organisms to get more oxygen. So these are just some of the Cambrian organisms. Some of them are really weird, and we wouldn't see anything like them today. You can see there are sponges. This is a worm that looks very much like some worms that are still around today, and some really weird things that, some things we're not even sure what phylum they belong to. They might be in, this might be an arthropod. Sometimes it's hard to tell because they're so weird and they're so different from anything alive today. So this is a trilobite. Trilobites were super abundant. They first appeared during the Cambrian period, and they went extinct before the appearance of the dinosaurs, but they were super abundant for over 100 million years. So why did it happen when it happened? Possibly due to an increase in atmospheric oxygen, because photosynthesis was increasing. Remember, all the oxygen in the atmosphere is coming from photosynthesis. So if we have more oxygen, that means more photosynthesis, which could have been due to a warming environment at the time. Before the Ediacaran, the Earth was extremely cold and mostly covered with ice. So as things are warming, it's possible that that was a contributing factor. It also is possible that we just see more fossils because hard shells evolved. Many things that appear in the Cambrian period have hard shells, like the trilobites, which are arthropods. And so they have an exoskeleton, which would be much more likely to fossilize. So it's possible that there wasn't any explosion of new forms. They just were fossilizing because now they had hard shells, more likely. And we're just seeing more fossils of them. So animal diversity continued post-Cambrian period in the Paleozoic, and finally plants colonized the land first, and then very shortly after that animals. And the first animals to colonize the land were the arthropods, which are the ancestors of insects and all the other land arthropods that we see today. And this is what one of the first and oldest fossil animals look like. Looks sort of like a centipede, obviously segmented, and because they were arthropods and had hard shells, we have a lot of fossils of them. So the next group of animals to colonize the land were vertebrates, which made the transition to land much later, almost 100 million years later, with the first amphibians. So let's look at our timeline here, because one of the hardest things with studying the history of life on Earth is getting a grip on that timeline. And just like when you're trying to find your way in anything, having landmarks and learning the landmarks helps you get a grip on things. So the landmarks in life, some of them are mass extinctions, which we'll talk about. And some of them are the first appearances of particular things. So these are the periods that we were just talking about. So the Neoproterozoic, this is where the Ediacaran animals first appear. Here, this period was very cold and the Earth was warming at this time. And then the Cambrian explosion happened, which, is probably a real explosion of diversification, but there's some argument about that maybe it's just due to so many hard-shelled animals being fossilized. It just looks like there was a huge explosion. And then later, 470 million years ago, we have the first land plants. And remember, at the same time with that, that would also include fungi, the first soil, and very shortly after that, we have the first evidence of land animals, and they were arthropods. Now, there could have been other land animals at the same time, things that live in the soil now, but we don't have any fossil evidence of that yet because they didn't have hard exoskeletons, and so they didn't fossilize very well. And then later, land vertebrates, and the first land vertebrates were amphibians. And they didn't look like any amphibians that are alive today. Maybe they most looked like a salamander, like a really huge salamander. But they weren't frogs, which are the amphibians we normally think about. We're going to talk more about amphibians in a couple of chapters here. The Mesozoic is the age of dinosaurs, and if you remember from our plant unit, this is also when the first angiosperms appear. They appear right in the middle of the Mesozoic. And remember our first plants here, these were the non-vascular plants. And towards the end here, right around this same time, is when we start to get the first vascular plants. Well before the Mesozoic, we have the first vascular plants, and the first gymnosperms appear here at the end of the Paleozoic. So going into the age of the dinosaurs, we have gymnosperms, ferns, non-vascular plants, and then angiosperms first appear in the fossil record, and right in the middle of the Mesozoic when dinosaurs were here. And then we have another mass extinction here that ended the dinosaurs and led us into the Cenozoic, which is the current era. So the Mesozoic era is often called the age of dinosaurs. This is bookended, the age of dinosaurs is bookended by mass extinctions. And I'll show you a chart that is more detailed with mass extinctions. 250 million years ago, there was a huge mass extinction, the Permian-Triassic extinction, and then 65 to 66 million years ago, there was another mass extinction, which is often called the KT mass extinction, but they're trying to change the name of that now. We'll talk more about that when we get to that section. But that's the age of dinosaurs. And during this period, the age of the dinosaurs, many other important organisms appeared, not just dinosaurs. So coral reefs first appear at this time. And remember, coral are animals, but they also have symbiotic algae that they take in from the water column and live with in their cells. And that gives both organisms benefit. The coral benefits because they get the sugar from the photosynthetic algae. The coral, though, are filter feeders, and they continue to feed from the water column, but it's mostly to get nitrogen and minerals, and they provide that to the algae. So that's an important symbiosis there with coral. That appears, which allows the evolution of a lot of other kinds of organisms. Coral reefs are an important marine ecosystem. So dinosaurs were the dominant terrestrial vertebrates. They take up most of the niches on land, so terrestrial means land. And there were also a few reptiles at that time that readapted to life in the sea, like ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs. And this is a dinosaur. We now know that huge percentage of dinosaurs had feathers. And so this is a better depiction of what one particular dinosaur would look like, and the angiosperms first appear. And we have our primitive angiosperms, like this is a magnolia. There were magnolias around at that time. They are one of the more primitive and first to appear angiosperms. And insects had been around for a long time, but insects massively diversify during the age of the dinosaurs as well. And all of the groups of insects that are around today appeared during that time. The Cenozoic is our modern era, and only for the last 65 million years, and this is often called the Age of Mammals, although many other important things have happened during that time. Although once the dinosaurs went extinct, mammals diversified. Although mammals were around almost the entire age of dinosaurs. So mammals have first evolved way at the beginning of the age of dinosaurs, at the beginning of the Mesozoic, but they were not dominant. They were small, insect eating, many of them were nocturnal, lived in burrows, and they really started to diversify after the extinction of the dinosaurs. Although, when the dinosaurs went extinct, we already had our three major groups of mammals were present. The egg-laying mammals, the pouched mammals, marsupials, and also the placental mammals. So they were all present when the dinosaurs went extinct already and had been evolving for over 100 million years at that time. Mass extinctions have been a very important part of the history of life on Earth, especially over since the Cambrian explosion, really. Mass extinctions have kind of shaped and defined evolution. And so let's review that a little bit. Okay, so what this graph shows is we start with the Cambrian explosion down here on the left and go all the way to the modern period here, the Quaternary period. So here's the age of the dinosaurs here, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous. Those are the periods in which the dinosaurs were around. And here we have all of the periods in between the Cambrian explosion and that huge extinction event. So what this graph shows here is how many different types of animals were alive at that time. How many different families of animals, how many different genera of animals. So the diversity, what kind of diversity of types of animals were around. And so you can see a Cambrian explosion, there's a large expansion, and then there is an extinction event that defines the end of the Ordovician and the Silurian periods. Animal diversity expands again, and then there's another mass extinction at the end of the Devonian and the beginning of the Carboniferous period. Some of these older ones, like these two, the Ordovician Silurian and the Devonian Carboniferous, not 100% sure what caused these. Was it an asteroid impact? Was it volcanic activity? The longer ago it is, the harder it is to be sure exactly what the cause was. We're much more confident of the Permian-Triassic extinction event, 250 million years ago. This is the largest mass extinction in the history of Earth that we have documented in the fossil record, 250 million years ago, and scientists are fairly certain what the cause is. It's thought that the cause was massive volcanic activity in what is now Siberia. There are massive lava fields that are 250 million years old in Siberia, And it's thought that if there was a massive outflow of lava all at the same time, the dust would have stayed in the atmosphere for decades. A massive amount of carbon dioxide would have been pumped into the atmosphere. And this would have had a huge effect on the climate. And in fact, about over 90% of the genera of animals that were alive at that time went extinct. In fact, many scientists think that all life on Earth nearly went extinct at this time because so much life went extinct in both in the ocean and on land. So this was a huge toxic event for Earth. That was probably due to a volcanic, not just one volcano erupting, but a field of volcanoes having a massive eruption event that perhaps lasted for 10,000 years. So this extinction was not a rapid, quick event. This extinction event took 10,000 years to occur. But the result was a massive reduction in the diversity of animal life. And then here there's another little mass extinction between the Triassic and the Jurassic. So you can see here there's a theme here that the ends of these periods are being defined often by a mass extinction event. And then we get to the end of the Cretaceous, and there's another large mass extinction event. This one is thought to be extremely rapid and may have happened as quickly as a few days, not 10,000 years like this one. And scientists are extremely certain now that it was an asteroid impact. They have found a crater that's the right age and the right size to be the impact crater. Of course, it's mostly eroded and buried now because of the way the crust is constantly being eroded and recycled. But it's a very interesting story of the discovery of this crater and its linking to this mysterious mass extinction, which we're now pretty sure was a very rapid extinction event. And since then, there's been diversification again and an increase in the diversity of life, including mammals and us. There are people who talk about the current extinction wave that's going on due to climate change. But if you compare to these other extinction events, 50% of animal families gone, 35% of animal families extinct, 60%, 30%. We're not even anywhere close to that. So although the rate of extinction is increasing right now, alarmingly so, we're not on the level of a mass extinction event, not even close, not yet. We could get there, but we're not there yet. It's not on the same level as one of these other mass extinction events. So that's the timeline here that includes the mass extinctions. And we'll talk more about the extinction event that led to the extinction of the dinosaurs and the Permian-Triassic extinction event as we talk about the diversification of animals in later chapters. In the second part of this chapter, the next video, we'll talk about morphological traits that we use to classify animals, like types of development, body plan, their symmetry, things like that. Okay,